Good day to everyone. A very warm welcome to this session of the 9th South-South Forum on Sustainability. My name is Lau Kin Chi. I am coordinator of the program on Cultures of Sustainability at the Center for Cultural Research and Development of Lingnan University. I am also a founding member of the Global University for Sustainability and the director of its executive team. We are most pleased and honored to have with us today Dr. Vandana SHIVA. South-South Forum participants are familiar with the presence of Dr. SHIVA. She was with us in 2020 in a panel on livelihood, food security, and ecology. And last year, she gave a lecture on Seeds of Hope, People's Resilience, Resistance, and Regeneration in Times of Public Health and Climate Disasters. These are all available on the Global University website. Dr. Vandana SHIVA is well known and much respected for her lifelong dedication in ecofeminism, biodiversity, food sovereignty, seed sovereignty, and anti-GMO and anti-globalization movements. She is a physicist by training. Her PhD was on quantum physics and the philosophy of science. She has written more than 20 books, and I would like to draw your attention to her latest book published this year, Terra Viva, My Life in a Diversity of Movements, which chronicles her life, thought, convictions, and commitment to movements for life. Dr. SHIVA is not only a prolific writer and insightful philosopher, she is an activist, putting her thought to action and theorizing her practices. You can find her footprints in different parts of India and all over the world. In 1991, she founded the organization NAVDANYA, which means 9 seeds or new gift, which works with the philosophy of a living earth and is a national movement to protect the diversity and integrity of living resources, especially native seed, and to promote organic farming and fair trade. This initiative established over 40 seed banks across India to provide regional opportunity for diverse agriculture. She received the Right Livelihood Award in 1993, which is regarded as an alternative Nobel Prize for livelihood. Today, Dr. Vandana SHIVA will be speaking on decolonizing knowledge to regenerate the earth and the future of humanity. Indeed, the prospect of a 6th mass extinction on Earth is looming. The National Geographic estimates that due to human-induced pollution and climate change, half of the planet's existing land and marine species may go extinct by the end of this century in 80 years. Just recently, the planet is scorched by exceptional heat, going to beyond 45 degrees Celsius in India and Pakistan, 52 degrees Celsius in Iran, and over 40 degrees in many parts of China. Newspaper headlines tell of forest fires in Portugal, Spain, and France. And our eyes must also turn to the immense suffering of peoples in Africa with the climate collapse, the locust plague, the droughts, the famines. In March this year, on the same day, Arctic temperature was 30 degrees higher than the normal average, and Antarctica temperature was 40 degrees higher than the normal average. If such news does not bring alarm to the general readers, if the images of large chunks of glaciers collapsing do not bring alarm, at least our bodily discomfort with the heat, with even hundreds dying from the heat, should trigger some warning. However, we still encounter skepticism about global warming and climate change, and still hang on to fossil fuel-based lifestyles and life as usual. The term climate change, I think, is too mild. I prefer to call it climate collapse. One key question is, why do most people seem immune to recognizing the severity of the issue and no action would follow without the acute understanding? This is a question I have been asking for several decades since I first read the IPCC reports. So maybe what Professor Dai Jinghua said at the July 8th inaugural lecture of this forum deserves our contemplation. If the omens of civilizational collapse are so frequent and severe, why is it that most people seem indifferent? Professor Dai said, "You cannot wake up someone who has chosen to pretend to be asleep. It is a kind of self-hypnotism which prevents our understanding the state of the world we are in and thus prevents our taking action to address the problems. That requires us to go deep into the problem rather than merely giving an account of the phenomena. Perhaps it has to do with our short-sightedness, our refusal to see a little bit further, our inability to see and feel the suffering inflicted on the earth and on humanity as a result of our aggressive intrusion into nature and cultures that inhibit the relentless advance of capitalism. This is certainly not some kind of inborn nature or a gift of nature, a nature that seeks its own termination by the hands of its own creation, man. We need to see that rather than gifted with the ability to thrive, we are deprived of the capacity to make connections to nature, to ourselves, and to others as a result of the colonizing forces of capitalistic drives with their modern institutions, such as modern education and mass media. They trap us and make our minds prone to be colonized and homogenized by capitalistic forces, with our body addicted to ways of life that hold the American way of life as model, with our blind faith in so-called development and progress. Dr. Vandana Shiva had investigated into the problem of the monoculture of the mind and had proposed many alternatives of hope. So we now turn to Dr. Shiva to illuminate us on the question of decolonizing knowledge and the future of humanity. So Dr. Shiva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kin Chi, and greetings to all of you who have joined this webinar. The challenge really is that every crisis we face, every crisis that is threatening our very existence as humanity, the health pandemic, the hunger pandemic, the poverty pandemic, the pandemic of fear and hopelessness, the climate emergency, the extinction emergency, the emergency of injustice and exclusion and inequality, of dispossession and disposability of large numbers of humanity, all have their roots in the colonizing mindset and a colonizing worldview. So decolonizing is first and foremost becoming aware of the false assumptions of systems that colonial powers used. And secondly, to create, defend, protect, strengthen systems that work with the earth, for the earth, and for the collective well-being and the global common good. At the end of the day, we are earth beings. You know, there's a very big industry right now on creating divisions among people on the basis of false identity. And Samuel Huntington was put on the job of writing this fat book before around the Iraq War. He was justifying the Iraq War. And the book is called The Clash of Civilizations. Now, you know, religions don't clash without being made to clash. My own land is a land of diverse religions. So many of the religions of the world have emerged from India, but all religions of the world have emerged from Asian soil. That Christianity and Islam and Judaism are Asian religions. We forget that because we've got such a Eurocentric obsession. We erase our own history. But the roots of our civilizations have been ecological civilizations. Otherwise, we couldn't have lasted as long as we did. For, you know, I've spent a lot of time working on agriculture, and in the books like Farmers of 40 Centuries, about Asian agriculture. Australian Aboriginal, farming for 16,000 years. Amazonian Indians in the forest, farming. People think the forest is just a forest. No, they farm in the forest. They grow fruit trees in the forest. And that too, there's evidence of 10,000 years. So how did we last that long? Because we worked according to the laws of the land, the laws of ecology, the laws of sustainability. When did these laws start to get broken? With colonial commerce, with colonization, both of knowledge, as well as the very defining of what an economy is. Colonial commerce was not an economy, it was war. Just look at the Opium Wars that devastated China. And that devastated our land because opium was grown here in India. And just think of it, that one East India Company was created to colonize our lands and found all kinds of amazing instruments to basically own our resources, transfer our wealth. I'll give you the case for India. In the 200 years of British rule, $45 trillion was transferred from India to England. Did they create that wealth? No. First, in 1783, Lord Cornwallis, on a piece of paper, just wrote that all the land of India belonged to the empire. It belonged to them. And therefore, the peasants of India became depeasantized and had to now pay a rent, which was half of the produce in cash. And it wasn't the produce of that year. It was the average produce, so that in a drought year, it meant all of the production of the peasant went to the British Empire. That's the reason we had 40 to 60 million people die of famines. And I know the similar story will be there for China. It wasn't that our farmers weren't growing food. Even in 1942, which was the Great Bengal Famine, we had enough rice. People shouldn't have starved if they had right to the rice they had grown. But they had to give the British Empire their produce as rent for their land. Now, I know definitely for all indigenous cultures I've been involved in, for Africa, for India, and I'm sure the case was China, must have been similar. You could not own land as property. Land was basically, you had rights to use, but not to trade and own and buy and sell. Land was not a commodity. That one fell swoop that made land a property and privatized our land, privatized the lands of the Africans. People in Canada are still fighting. People in the United States are still fighting for their land rights. And interestingly, right now, one would think the issue of land is of the past colonialism, but it's part of the new colonialism. You might have noticed the huge protests in Netherlands, apparently about a nitrogen problem. So I did a quick study. Farmers are protesting against the fact they were forced to use the industrial agriculture systems that are the problem, but worse, they're saying, you want to bankrupt us? You want to destroy us as farmers so that you can take our land. This is a land grab. And I'll come back to this later in my talk, because, for me, our moment this particular year has been an interesting year, because every study that I've done, which was ignored for 20 years and 30 years, the language of our work is being appropriated and given a totally different direction and a different meaning. And I call this greenwashing. So for me, greenwashing is the new colonialism. Today, colonialism will not happen because directly they'll say, we want your land. But they will say, no, You have to do this in order to save the planet, which we will continue to destroy. And that's what the zero budget is, the zero net zero issue is. I'll come back to that later. So colonial commerce was elevated to economy by Adam Smith, who's called the father of economics, of modern economics. You know, I think one big problem is the patriarchal problem. Colonizers make themselves the fathers of entire disciplines. Yeah. So it's not that economies didn't exist before. Economy, the word economy is derived from the word oikos, our home, the earth. Taking care of our home is the true economy. Aristotle called it the art of living. And he differentiated this from primatistics, the art of money making. And Aristotle laid out very clearly that if I produce and I exchange directly with the user, that is a true economy because it's involved in the art of living that people should live. But the minute there's trade for profit alone, it has become money making. It's become primatistics. And it's interesting that it's from Aristotle's work on the economy that Karl Marx was inspired. He developed in Das Kapital the labor theory of value, showing that trade and commerce extract labor. And we would add in our work, they extract the wealth of nature. As a result of which we have poverty of nature, which is the ecological crisis, and we have social poverty, which is not just the poverty crisis that has been endemic now with all these years of colonialism, but the new poverty crisis, even in the lands which had such good standard of living because they had a welfare state, their taxes were distributed. Just look at the marches on cost of living across Europe, across North America, because people can't afford to live anymore because everything has been commoditized and everything is being financialized. So when Marx talks about surplus value and extraction of surplus value, he was citing Aristotle's work and a very, very, a classic, an Italian classic by Virgil, which talked about the limitless hunger for money, for gold, ori sacre farmers. That the real hunger on this planet is the hunger for money, is the hunger of greed that can never, ever be satiated. So when Adam Smith writes an inquiry into nature and causes of the wealth of nations, 1776, that's precisely when India is being colonized. That's precisely when extractivism, robbery, militarism are stealing our wealth. And this is elevated to be called the economy. Smith perpetuates all the myths. India, if we were the capital of textiles, and our textiles and our spices is what the British wanted. And the way first they wrote the free trade agreement, 1711 or 1716, the first free trade agreement was the British East India Company and a collapsing Mughal empire, which basically said no taxes for the invaders, but taxes for local people. No military protection for local traders, but military protection for the East India Company traders. This then started the destruction of local economies. This unequal taxation system has always been the way, private property creation and unequal taxation. Our textiles is what the British came for. And here is Adam Smith writing how India's textiles are primitive. They were stealing our textiles. And he's calling it primitive because he was justifying the entire industrialization. Worse, he defines the indigenous people of America were rising in this collapse with a new vision of working together with love and compassion for all our relatives on earth. I see the earth as one earth family. Indigenous people see the earth as one earth family. Adam Smith defined the sophisticated indigenous cultures of North America as the first economic and social stage, the lowest and the rudest state of society, such as we find in the tribes of North America. If we had stayed in that system, we wouldn't have destroyed this planet. We wouldn't be causing as much hunger as there is, and poverty, and wars, and conflicts, and competition. Smith talks about competition. We are born with competition in our mother's womb. That too is a false construct. A fetus in a mother's womb gets loved, gets scared. Competition is something that is imposed through a competitive society for greed. He basically made, built on the idea of primitiveness that is so vital to colonialism. But the same issue that was made so foundational for the economic model was also made the basis of the science model, science technology, epistemology. Episteme is the Greek word for knowledge, systems of understanding. Epistemology is ways of knowing, because every human being has knowledge. All cultures have knowledge. Just like economy disappeared and commercial and capitalist colonial commerce was defined as economy, the non-economy, the diseconomy was made the economy. In a very similar way, the knowledges, our knowledges, were defined as not knowledge. And we have called it epistemicide, the killing of knowledge, the deliberate annihilation of knowledge. I'll just give you two examples. We've all come through now 2 years of COVID. Initially, there was a denial that something like natural immunity exists. Systems of healthy eating build up immunity. Our herbs build our immunity. So in Chinese medicine and in Indian Ayurvedic medicine, there's deep knowledge of building immunity. All this was rubbished during the COVID propaganda. Any natural healing was absolutely removed from any communication. And it's very interesting that, the 4 or 5 technology giants who made money through globalization, paid no taxes, have now used the COVID disaster to lock us into all kinds of new economic dependencies. But more importantly, they are now controlling communication between people. They decide what will be communicated on Facebook, what will be communicated on Twitter, what will be communicated in YouTube. The best of knowledge systems are being shut down. And I have a friend who, we created in the 80s a wonderful movement for indigenous knowledge and indigenous science and technology. And we found amazing teachers who had looked at this, that in the 18th century, actually India and China were far more sophisticated than England in science and technology. Our knowledges were taken, presented at the Royal Society. And then our traditional practices were banned, a very clear case. We used to have smallpox vaccination called variolation in India. And it used to have 99.9% success in controlling the spread of smallpox. Well, this was presented in England. They developed vaccines and made it illegal for Indians to use their traditional system, where house to house, there was a whole community that would go. Then the smallpox epidemic started, because the British couldn't reach every doorstep. But this, we were the best steel makers. Our steel making was taken and our local steel making was banned. We had the best ships. Indian ships could not sail to England And then shipbuilding was banned. So if you look, I mean, I'm sure if we look at this epistemic side, what happened to India happened to China. And we were made to look like knowledge primitives. The most sophisticated civilizations in terms of centuries of scientific work were made to look like we didn't know. The pirated knowledge is what was then used. And this has not stopped. I work on seeds, Linji mentioned. And I work on issues and rules of globalization, which were created by the WTO. Actually, they weren't created by the WTO. The WTO was created by the corporations. The corporations that wanted a bigger global market, like the old East India Company, now they were coming as the new East India Company. And who are these companies? Monsanto, which didn't even exist it existed as a war industry. It made Agent Orange, it made chemicals to kill. It has become the biggest controller of seed. And now, of course, it's been bought out by Bayer. But it's still the same Monsanto technologies. They wanted to own the seed. And they wanted to push genetically modified organisms as a way of claiming that they've invented something new, and therefore that's property, intellectual property, and therefore they must have rights, and farmers should not be allowed to save not just their seeds, but the corporate seed. And when I was at a meeting in '87 when these companies were saying this, and I said, but you don't invent a seed. Seed is the continuity of life. And farmers have been the breeders over centuries. You cannot criminalize farmers for saving seeds. And I took a pledge to start NAVDANYA, the movement for seed saving, but also resisting the idea of intellectual property rights on life. Life is not invented by corporations. Life is. So I started to create the community seed banks. We created more than 150. They've helped our communities deal with disasters, climate disasters. We've saved salt-tolerant seeds that can deal with the cyclones and that come from the Bay of Bengal, drought-tolerant seeds that can deal with the repeated extended droughts we face, flood-tolerant seeds, because we are all facing huge floods. But even more importantly, nutrition-dense seeds, because industrial agriculture is not about eating and nourishment and health. It's about trading. Yeah, it's chromatistics. How do you produce a volume and weight of commodity to trade? This does not feed the world. Worse, because when it's all about profit, that limitless hunger for greed, three things start to happen. First, only GMOs grow because there's royalty connected with it. So why is there GMO corn and soya everywhere? Because Monsanto gets royalty payments for every acre planted, and Cargill gets a monopoly. But they are not going to feed the hungry people because they don't work on the basis of the rights of people to live, to have food, to have water, to have health, to have livelihoods, to have justice. They work on the assumption of profit. So if it's more profitable to take the corn and soya and turn it into biofuel to run cars, or turn it into animal feed, to put all the animals into concentration camps, that's animal feed industry drives the factory farming industry. So we have more and more and more commodities and more hunger. 1 billion people are hungry. But even more and more people are sick because of the bad food, because the food is not meant to be eaten. I have called it anti-food. Food is for health. Food is for nourishment. When food doesn't nourish you and makes you sick, the chronic diseases. Let me just share with you the contemporary figures. We've done a number of books on this. Diseases and costs annually for the global cancer epidemic, 2.5 trillion, diabetes, totally related to the diet, 2.5 trillion, infertility, 3.6 billion, endocrine disruption, 549 billion, antibiotic resistance, which is also coming from factory farming, 1 trillion, obesity, 1.2 trillion, birth defects, 22.9 billion, and this is totally related to the toxics in the food, neurodegenerative diseases, 2.4 trillion, autism, 171 billion, The figures of the Center for Disease Control in the United States have predicted that every second child in America will be autistic. It used to be 1 in 100,000, then it became 1 in 1,000. Then I traveled, it was 1 in 65. The last time I traveled, it was 1 in 30. And they're predicting that every second kid will be autistic. An autistic child basically means you have to constantly look after them and take care of them. They will never be independent, sovereign. They need care throughout their lives. And this in an area where you have zero public health care in America. The second part of the treaty, so intellectual property, I said, I'm not going to accept this. We're going to save seeds. We're going to defend the farmers' right to save seeds. We wrote laws that said the farmers had an absolute right to breed, conserve, exchange, sell their seeds. PepsiCo tried to sue 4 potato farmers in India. When you drink a Pepsi, you don't think that the Lay's chips has intellectual property related to it. Well, they tried to sue Indian farmers. And when I saw this in the newspaper, I immediately sent a book we have on my 30 years of work on biodiversity and seeds and intellectual property. And I sent it to the lawyers who were fighting for the farmers. Pepsi was fining them 10 million rupees each for saving potato seeds. So I sent this book and I showed the part of the law, which I was part of drafting, that farmers' right to save seed can never be alienated. And that case had to be withdrawn by Pepsi because the laws of the land were going against them. That's why laws are important, to regulate criminals and thieves. I also worked with our parliament. I constantly go and talk to them about patenting seed, patenting life, what its consequences were. And our parliament put in the amendment of our patent law, an Article 3J, which says, plants, animals, seeds and their parts are not human inventions, therefore they cannot be patented. And this is something we must do all over the world. So we prevented the criminalization of seed saving by farmers, and we prevented the privatization of life by the corporations. Well, the second agreement in WTO is the agreement on agriculture. This was written, the intellectual property agreement was written by Monsanto, and they said it as much. They said we were the patient, the diagnostician, the physician all in one. We wrote the treaty. Cargill, vice president, was made the United States representative in WTO in GATT. Cargill wrote the agricultural agreement. So everyone is now talking about hunger and worrying about Africa not having food because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They're not mentioning the last 30 years when African countries were forced to destroy their food security and food sovereignty so that Cargill could dump on them. There's $400 billion of subsidy in the food system. So high cost production is made cheap through these subsidies, and then this is used to dump and destroy local food production. I know how this happened because I've had to fight case after case after case every time these dumping took place. In some places where our laws were still intact, we were able to prevent it. But there's constant attempt to change national laws in order for the corporations to destroy our food sovereignty and monopolize our food. The third agreement is an agreement that just shouldn't be there at all. It's called the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement. And it appears to be about health. This was written by Pepsi, Coke, Nestle. And this is basically an attempt, a very underhand attempt to destroy local food systems, artisanal food systems, and have only the industrial system that is giving us all of these chronic diseases. Ultra-processed food is what these companies bring. This is central, to the chronic disease problem. But the chronic disease problem is our health problem. The climate havoc is the health problem of the planet. Just like when we eat the wrong food, we have metabolic disorders. Diabetes is recognized as a metabolic disorder. Many scientists even see cancer as a metabolic disorder. But the earth is suffering from a metabolic disorder. we have been made to think that the earth is dead and the earth is inert. And very big role in this is just like Adam Smith was made the father of modern economics. Francis Bacon was made the father of modern science. Who was Bacon? Bacon was the Chancellor of England, not a scientist. He was in charge of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was the process of killing knowledge holders and knowledge keepers in Europe. These were called the witch hunts. 9 million people were killed in the witch hunts, which was the first epistemicide. If you look at information, the people who were killed were the social leaders, the epistemic leaders of their society, because what was being put in place was the idea that nature is dead and we are separate from nature. I have called this ecological apartheid. Apartheid is the word of the Afrikaans in South Africa for separation. This is how they built the regime of the blacks being inferior, the whites being superior, therefore the whites ruling over the blacks and taking over their land. Well, this is what exactly the pattern that is there globally. Bacon went out of his way to not just replicate the witch hunts into knowledge. He basically declared, he wrote a book called The Birth of Masculine Time. He wrote a book called Atlantis, New Atlantis. He said, we will create a blessed race of heroes and supermen to control nature. For Bacon, knowledge was not about seeking truth, but an instrument of conquest. He talked about repeatedly how we had to establish, it's with unified forces against the nature of things. It had to be war against nature, to storm and occupy her castles and strongholds and extend the boundaries of human empire as far as God Almighty in his goodness may permit. So they were trying to establish an empire over life. This is why we have anthropocentrism, the idea that human beings are superior to other species, and then some human beings are superior to other cultures, other races. This dominion of man over the universe is what allowed colonialism. It was the very foundation of conquest. As Caroline Merchant has written in a really good book, I recommend to all of you, Death of Nature. As a conceptual framework, the mechanical order has associated with it a framework of values based on power, fully compatible with the directions taken by commercial capitalism. So when Bacon was building on the superiority of men of the European race to recover their right over nature on the basis of what God has given them, it was then clothed in a new creation myth, the doctrine of discovery. This is how Columbus would just take over all the lands of Latin America and the East India Company. If you look at the papal bull, the rights that were given for the colonization of the Americas to the Spanish and the Portuguese, the language is exactly the same for the charter Queen Elizabeth gave to the East India Company in 1600. What basically was being denied was that we are part of nature. We are living, nature is living, and all this was done in terms of torturing nature to extract her secrets. But nature is living, she only responds to gentle conversations, not to violence and not to war. That is why we have been so badly misled in terms of our relationship with the earth. Take two examples that have, I've spent a lot of time. One is on the issue of agriculture. We're constantly made to believe that industrial agriculture feeds the world. I just had a German journalist interviewing me on this. And he says, but we can't feed the world with ecological agriculture. I said, you're basically saying that anything that works according to laws of ecology is unproductive. And everything that destroys the very base in nature of soil, of biodiversity, of water, of land, that you destroy nature, you'll have food. I said, a dead planet will give nobody any food. You will not have food on a dead planet. Your recipes are recipes of killing the planet. And then, of course, we've done so much work You know, I saved seeds because I felt seeds must be saved. I believe in the intrinsic worth of all life. I do not think living systems are objects. I do not believe women are objects. I do not believe people of other races are objects who can be taken as slaves to North America. We are all autonomous, sentient beings. And as sentient beings, we are connected to other beings. We are interbeings. And as interbeings, we have not just the right to live, we have a duty to care. We have a duty to protect others. That is what. Okay, got it. Thank you. Yeah. As sentient beings, you know, we have autonomy. Big debates taking place in North America, where the fetus and the mother is being pitted against each other. You know, this is what I call the divide and rule, where you put everything other against everything, including every part of the human body, every part of a pregnant woman. Yeah. And this is the idea that Adam Smith was talking about: competition, 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 as if my hands are in competition with my head, you know? No, we are a beautiful, self-organized, creative system. And this self-organized creative system is what interacts with all other self-organized creative systems. That's what the earth is. When we destroy that fabric, we create disease and we create the crisis that the planet is facing. Today, 200 species are going to extinction every day because we've developed instruments of driving species to extinction, because we developed chemicals in Hitler's labs that were designed to exterminate some people because they were defined as inferior. That same group of companies called IG Farben and Standard Oil, who were making these chemicals to kill people in Hitler's concentration camps, are the ones who continue to sell these chemicals as agrochemicals. And that's why they are so well organized to tell lie on lie on lie, that they produce food, they feed the world, that their toxics like the glyphosate is harmless, GMOs are harmless, GMOs will mean there'll be no pests ever and no weeds. We've just done a big detailed study. The GMO BT cotton has totally failed. The pink bollworm has overtaken it. Farmers are spraying more pesticides. The yield is coming down like this. The incomes of the farmers are coming down like this. And we save old seeds. We share them with the farmers. We help farmers go ecological and organic. And you can choose the word you want, because that's another thing. You know, you fight over words, you know, this divide and rule. I say, but all systems that work with nature are ecological. You can choose the word natural. You can choose the word organic. You can choose the word permaculture. You can choose the word biodynamic. These are different schools, but different schools don't create new laws and principles. The principles are the same laws of ecological regeneration, recycling, and biodiversity. You cannot avoid diversity. When I wrote Monoculture of the Mind, it's because I was seeing our entire rich, diverse systems, which are more productive, were being called unproductive because the commercial view was only looking at what they could exploit, the eucalyptus. So they were cutting down rainforests to grow eucalyptus. They were cutting down and destroying the 250 crops Punjab used to grow rice that was designed for chemicals, and wheat designed for chemicals. The Green Revolution, I have a book on this called The Violence of the Green Revolution, and this is why I've dedicated my life since that time. And, you know, I understand the power of big money determining what knowledge reaches people. Right now, people are not, I mean, look at the protests that have taken place in Netherlands. Show me a BBC or a CNN coverage of these protests within Europe, and a decent understanding of what's going on. There's an amazing censorship going on. And that's why things like the Global University become even more important for us to know our truth, discover our truth, and build our solidarities. On climate change, I wrote a book called Soil Not Oil in the lead up to the Copenhagen summit, which was destroyed by Mr. Obama. And, the US pretends to be very environmental, but they destroy the legally binding treaty. And it was Evo Morales, who was the president of Bolivia, got up and said, we were here to protect Mother Earth, not the rights of the polluters. So I'm going to go back and call the people of the world, and we will write a declaration on the rights of Mother Earth and climate change. And that's what was drafted, and it's available in NAVDANYA's publications, and it's called the Draft Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. In Soil Not Oil, I had indicated that all the discussion was only about consumptive energy, the electricity that we use. But food is energy. And how you grow your food, how you distribute your food, how you process your food has a very big contribution to climate change. At that time, I just took from IPCC the different categories which feed into the food system. And if you add up the different categories, which at that time they were not talking about as one category, but it was transformation, transportation, industry, forest land use. I added this up. 14% is in use of fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based chemicals that contribute to climate change. For 1 liter of these nitrogen, for 1 kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer, you need 2 liters of diesel. It's a fossil fuel fertilizer. Most people don't realize this. The big heavy machinery, fossil fuel driven, 14%. But the greed, this limitless hunger for gold has made agribusiness, Monsanto, Cargill, BlackRock invade into the Amazon. The destruction of forests, like the Indonesian rainforest or the Amazon rainforest or in the Congo Delta. This destruction of forests for agribusiness is another 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. And then you take good food, for me, real food is I can go into my garden and pick a salad. I can go into my garden and pull out a radish. That is food, direct from the soil to me. The most intimate, close relationship. The more intimate that relationship, the healthier is the food. Because the biodiversity of the soil and the biodiversity of our gut are totally interconnected. Trillions of organisms in the soil, 100 trillion microbes in our gut, and they nourish each other, So if we only use 1 or 2 crops, and then we keep processing them into oil, into milk, into flour, what we get is new toxic diseases, new destruction of the gut microbiome. So 20% of the greenhouse gases come from long transportation. I call it food miles, thousands of miles. And there's even a myth being spread that because we have urbanization, we can't have local food. No, you can still have a food shed. It can be a larger food shed. It could be not 100 miles, it could be 1,000 miles, but it'll still be as local as can be, because we have to stop the degradation of food and the destruction of the planet. So food miles, distribution, transport, processing, very energy intensive to turn good food to bad. Take something like soya oil. It's pulled out with a solvent extraction plant. 400 degrees temperature. Put in neurotoxins to get rid of the side effect. This is not food. So if you add 14%, 20%, 20%, and because you've created a system of uniformity, monocultures, long distance transportation, you have a lot of waste. This whole best before date. Now, if I have a bad banana, I can see it's a bad banana. I might feed it to a pet, or I might compost it. It never goes waste. In a local system, there's nothing like waste. Nature knows no waste. Local economies know no waste. The globalized, greedy system creates waste, whether it be the waste in food or it be the waste in packaging, we are drowning under plastic packaging. All of this is because of long distance transport. I know in China and India, we don't know anything like waste. In a plant too, you know, for us, like the banana is a very important plant. We use, of course, the fruit. We use the fruit ripe and raw. The flowers, the red flowers are cooked. Even the stem. In Bengal, they chop it into beautiful little dices and cook it. Every plant, every part of every plant has a use, just like every part of every human being has contributions to make. The monoculture of the mind says, you are just this, and you will not be allowed to move this way or that way, and you do not have more than one function. So it's not just a monoculture of the mind, it's a one-dimensional mind. And as a one-dimensional mind, it's forcing the world into one-dimensionality. And our plants are losing not just their diversity. In India, we had evolved 200,000 rice varieties, our peasants. NAVDANYA has saved 4,000. And rice is very particular to particular regions. We can't, if I've saved rice in East India, I can't transfer it to Dehradun. And the Dehradun Himalayan rices will not go to the south. But in every part we've added, and 4,000 rices we've saved. We've been so grateful we've been able to do this work. But the rice itself is not just the grain we eat. The straw is eaten by our animals. When I started NAVDANYA, there was a part of India where rice evolved, and the people had amazing huts with lovely thatch. And they were still using old varieties of rice. And I asked them, I said, why do you still use your old varieties? And this peasant explained to me so simply. He says, well, the straw of my traditional rice creates a patch that prevents the rain from falling through. The new varieties are like stalks to take up the chemicals. And, they're hard. And it's like, things like this, the rain will fall right through. So it was their housing that was protecting the rice varieties. We have 1,500 varieties of wheat, same for wheat. We just, it's not just for humans, it's also for animals, it's also for the soil. Take something like apple, right? An apple is a tree. But I have seen apple reduced to a stem in the Alps in Switzerland, where they're spraying so much pesticide, because if you take just a branch of an apple and make it grow, it has no roots. The roots are that shallow. You're having to keep it up with either aluminium or asbestos, huge amounts of material used. When the apple tree can stand by itself against gravity, it doesn't need any support. It gives you shade. It gives you the apple. It gives all kinds of community to all life. This stem is designed to maximize the output of apple by destroying the tree itself. And I think this is the colonial mindset, where you don't see the earth as a whole, and you don't see its functions. You don't see the plant as a whole, and you don't see its functions. And you declare this does not exist, it's inert, it's useless, throw it away. This is how biodiversity has disappeared. 80 to 90% biodiversity is gone because of this extermination attitude. Living systems, the biodiversity of the mind, the ecology of the mind requires we create the knowledge of coexistence and coevolution. I know the plant is living, I'm living. The conversation between the plant and me is the breeding that our farmers gave so much diversity. Now, in terms of climate change, there is at this point a whole new colonial endeavor. So they've appropriated our work on agriculture, but now they want to destroy agriculture on the grounds that we've shown industrial agriculture caused climate damage. Ecological agriculture did not cause climate damage, but ecological agriculture is needed to heal the earth, because agriculture is care for the land. Earth care is the most important climate action, not just ethically, but also scientifically. because the green leaf of a plant is the most miraculous technology. This planet used to be 290 degrees centigrade. 4,000 parts per million. You know, people panic with 400 parts per million. 4,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide, 98% carbon dioxide. Then the earth created a microbes, a plants, a leaves. And then the leaves started to pull out the carbon dioxide through the process of synthesis, photosynthesis. It didn't just pull out the carbon dioxide. It gave us food. It gave us carbohydrates, called The Molecule of Life by my dear friend Andre Lou, who's done a beautiful book right now called Growing Life. And that's not all. Just because this is not a machine and one-dimensional, gives us food and it gives us oxygen to breathe, gives us life. So we could arrive on this planet 200,000 years ago. But the process also cooled the planet. A 290 degrees centigrade was reduced to 13 degrees centigrade. 98% of carbon dioxide was reduced to 0.03% carbon dioxide. This is the law through which we can work to deal with climate change. Now, most people who don't understand the life of the earth, who don't understand that co-creating with the earth, we can address climate change, who think that old empire of superior men over the earth and other beings, over women, over other races, that is the mastery they must continue. They are offering false solutions of greenwashing. And among these false solutions of greenwashing, let me point out a few. If we know we have tampered with the earth, then stopping the tampering is the first step we must take. So one of the steps by which a false solution is being offered is, you know, the person I think you all should read and look out for is this gentleman, Bill Gates, How to Avoid Climate Catastrophe. He's got a number of things in there that are rubbish, but that's the problem. Not only is money creating the rules, money is able to tell lies and get away with it and make everyone believe that this is true. So, as I mentioned, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is a big part of the problem, not only because it uses fossil fuels, but emits a nitrous oxide that is 300 times more damaging than carbon dioxide. The Dutch farmers are being told to reduce the nitrogen problem. Here is the most brilliant man on the planet saying, I love fertilizers. We must have more fertilizers. Yeah? The problem is being offered as the solution. That's not all. The manipulation of the planet, indirectly because of fossil fuels and chemicals and destruction of biodiversity and forests, is now being accelerated with what he calls geoengineering, yeah? Solar management. Basically putting pollutants into the sky so that they block the sun. And he says this will cool the planet. I said, but the sun is needed for life on Earth. Without the sun, there is no photosynthesis. Every Nobel laureate who is promoting genetic geoengineering, so but that's not our field. We are just looking at cooling the planet. And that's the problem. Cooling the planet and growing life must go together. And growing life is cooling the planet, not geoengineering. And there's more and more work on ionizing radiations. If you'll have seen, not only is there a climate problem, there's an engineered climate problem. I have a report right here with me. American Air Force, owning the weather by 2025. We will control the weather to create rain where we want to and drought where we want to. We will punish enemy countries and enemy countries, including people who are autonomous in trade. Yeah. So we are finding very strangely, just at sowing time and harvest time, we get unpredictable rains. Anyway, there's climate happening. But we must not ignore the fact that geoengineering is a project. Secondly, we know industrial food has caused the problem. Industrial food system is 50% of the greenhouse problem. What is Mr. Gates addressing? Fake meat processed with more energy in the labs. Even fake breast milk. He's even given money for bio milk, a fake breast milk made in a lab. To me, this is a violation of the right of the child and the right of the women. And thereafter, everything, Silicon Valley has jumped in a big way on investing in fake food. But if you realize what I said earlier, that the health of the planet, the soil of the planet, and our bodily health through the gut microbiome is one indivisible health. This recipe of alienation from the soil and alienation from our body will be a recipe for more destruction of our health and more damages in terms of chronic diseases. And I think this is something, if China can look into it, it has an amazing scientific capacity to be able to look into the harms of fake food. The third, which is the real colonization, is again mentioned for the first time in this book. And then it became part of the Glasgow output. It works so fast. A phrase called net zero. He says in the book, net zero doesn't mean getting rid of pollution. Net zero means we'll continue to pollute, but we will offset our pollutions by having sinks in other people's land. And I've had debates, you know, the person who's now the UNFCCC, the climate chief, on the financing of net zero. He was the Bank of England governor. You know, he said, you've got everything in place. You've got the plumbing of net zero in place. It's just what's missing is the land. And that's why we have to find markets for offset. So what are they actually saying? We have to recolonize the world for its land. We have to dispossess the peasants and the farmers and destroy the economies because their land is only our offset. Land is not living. Land is not Mother Earth. The farmers don't have a right to live. We are going to force feed people fake food and meantime, reduce the land to a junkyard. So we are not your saints. We are not your carbon waste. You sort out your pollution. We will take care of the earth. This was called carbon colonization by the third world countries in Glasgow. If this so-called architecture comes through, there'll be new conditionalities. It'll be linked to World Bank and IMF. It'll be linked to all kinds of borrowings of the financial institutions. It'll be imposed by the new financial asset management funds like the BlackRock and Vanguard, about whom I've written in my book, Oneness versus the 1%. But the most important thing is they're cooking up, just like Adam Smith cooked up an economy to destroy the world with competition. They're now cooking up a new economy to destroy the world in the name of saving the world. Rockefeller, who was behind the Green Revolution in India, Rockefeller, who was behind with Gates, the Green Revolution in Africa, Rockefeller, which was behind criminalizing herbal medicine and healing, natural healing. He criminalized it in America. He created Big Pharma. He created Big Ag. He created chemical agriculture, industrial agriculture. He, sitting with the Wall Street, with the New York Stock Exchange, just cooks up a whole new asset class, natural asset companies that's sitting in New York. They will declare which part of the planet is their asset. Then they will gamble on it on Wall Street. And in the gambling, they are imagining $4,000 trillion of profits for them. But their profits can only be based on disenfranchising the people who are on the land, who are on the river, who are in a forest. And that's why together we must rise as one humanity on one planet to protect the earth and our future. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. What a beautiful speech Dr. Shiva has given us. So we had reviewed the colonial project of depriving India of its capacities and then creating the myths of how primitive these knowledge systems were. And Dr. Shiva also explained the current plight of food systems and agriculture, and telling us, explaining how the colonial mindset is one-dimensional and do not see plants and earth as a whole. And then the references to what Bill Gates and the financial tycoons are doing. And then Dr. Shiva also mentioned Rockefeller. Actually, if we look at the history of this replacement of Chinese herbal medicine by Western medicine in the 1920s and 30s, that was what Rockefeller did. And so, and how they created the Western medicines and then put in their people in the administration of the Kuomintang government at that time. So, so there is such a lot in common that we have to try to tease out, to look at the histories, and then also to see how we can be decolonizing the mind and also decolonizing knowledge. So now I would like to invite Rebecca, Dr. Rebecca Johnson to speak to us. So Dr. Rebecca Johnson is a feminist peace activist with a PhD on multilateral nuclear diplomacy. She is currently director of the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy, which she founded in 1996. In the 1980s, she campaigned at the Greenham Common, the US Air Force nuclear base in Britain, for the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that banned cruise, purging, and SS-20 missiles from Europe. Later, she coordinated Greenpeace's international campaign for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and in 2010 became a founding co-chair and president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the ICAN. Established its Geneva office with the humanitarian strategy to mobilize international civil society and governments, leading to the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. ICAN was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Along with ICAN's staff and steering group members, Dr. Johnson has been using the Nobel Medal to inspire campaigners around the world to end military-industrial crimes against humanity, from environmental destruction to arms sales, war, and sexual violence. So in the 6th South-South Forum on Sustainability in June 2019, Dr. Johnson came to Hong Kong to hold a global university summer study camp on nuclear weapons and power, current challenges and responses. She was also keynote speaker on feminist humanitarian reframing of global security activism. So the floor is yours, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Kin Chi. Oh, Dr. Shiva, I hope I can call you Vandana, because I feel so honored to be asked to give this commentary after you have just been so erudite, effective, connected in all the ways that you have talked about the problems we're facing, but also you as an activist have worked to change how we think about all these problems we're facing, and also then how we challenge them. And I just want you to know that actually you have inspired me for many, many years. As Kin Chi mentioned, in 1982, I started living at the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. And we weren't actually working for the INF Treaty, although that became the outcome. We simply, we just couldn't stand any longer to live under the threats of nuclear weapons with yet another new generation of what were called, cruise, Pershing, SS-20s, but were basically a new generation of weapons meant to fight a nuclear war, despite all the garbage, and I use that term now, but the rhetoric of the military nuclear industrial establishments about deterrence. In my country, one of the 9 nuclear armed states in the world today, always use that PR developed in the United States during the 1950s to say, well, we have to have nuclear weapons for deterrence. We've got to threaten to use the nuclear weapons for deterrence. And deterrence means we're never actually going to use them because they're going to prevent war and they're going to prevent nuclear war. These were lies. These were intentional, deliberate PR lies. And excuse me, that really is part of my starting point on this, because I was just a young woman who'd, you know, done my first degree, then taught for a couple of years in Japan, and then come actually to China in 1981 just to, it was a you know, a country that, and cultures that fascinated me. I was only allowed a short visit, but I took the Trans-Siberian train from Beijing in September of 1981, and then traveled right across the Soviet Union, as it then was. Well, traveled north up to Harbin, and then the wheels of the train were changed, and unfortunately so was the restaurant car, and in we went into the Soviet Union. And I did that because I wanted to see this country that was supposed to be my enemy. And what did I see? I saw lots of people like me, lots of women bringing the food that they had cooked, the chicken, the vegetables that they had grown, and reaching them up to the train windows. And I would reach the money down, and it was the best food in the world. Certainly a lot better than it. I think there were only 2 dishes at that time, solyanka and borscht, I think, or fried eggs maybe. But what I did was learn that, you know, the importance of seeing people and not just seeing countries, and certainly not just seeing countries constructed by colonialism and by military industrial rivalries going back in some cases centuries, and not constructed by the myths and the you know, and the very dangerous stereotypes and stories of danger and threat that are mobilized, have been mobilized by so many of our countries over our whole histories in some cases. So, you know, there we were, and I called myself an ecofeminist from that time that I first began to go to Greenham. But I only began to understand the meanings of ecofeminism a couple years after I'd been living, and was still living at Greenham, because I ended up there for 5 years, and did indeed only leave Greenham when the US and Soviet Union signed the INF Treaty in 1987. But what changed me far more fundamentally, I think, was when a woman called Zolde Ishtar came to Greenham and then started challenging us. Why don't you talk about what the UK nuclear weapons have been doing to the Pacific, to the Aboriginal peoples? And quite a lot of us were like, well, tell us what you mean. I mean, I was that ignorant of what UK nuclear weapons and UK nuclear testing had done at that point. And she said, no, I'm a white woman from Australia, and what I want Greenham women to do is to raise the money and invite and bring women from the Aboriginal communities that have been affected so terribly by British plutonium trials in Maralinga, by the nuclear testing, and bring women from the Marshall Islands, bring women from Kiribati to talk to us about the UK, US, and also the French nuclear testing and militarization of the Pacific and the harm that that has done, and to speak in their own voices. And that's what we did. And we didn't only listen to them at Greenham, we organized for them to speak up and down the country. And this is when I began to understand so much more about the wisdoms and the different ways of thinking about the earth, the living earth, as you have called it, that is really very central to so many Pacific and Aboriginal cultures. And up until then, I had kind of been very much more, was talking about nuclear weapons, but I talked about them in the framing of those that actually deployed them. I prided myself on actually doing that rather well and challenging the governments on their own terms. But I began to try to rethink how I did that, to try to learn and have a different narrative for myself. And I actually began to learn more about my own heritage, which is in Wales and also on the borderlands of England originally, but which included my growing up on what's known as a Hutterite colony, very like the Amish people in North Dakota, where we were taught we have to worship God with our hands, which meant growing our own food. But there were also some very patriarchal aspects to those particular Christian communities. But while we were doing this in North Dakota, the ash clouds, the radioactive mushroom clouds from over 900 nuclear weapons tests in places like New Mexico and Nevada on indigenous people's lands of the Western Shoshone in particular in Nevada. And if the wind was blowing towards California, to the big cities of Los Angeles or Las Vegas or the West Coast, with San Francisco, then they didn't do a test. If the wind was blowing that way, they didn't do a test. But they'd do tests if they were, if the wind was blowing towards Utah or North and South Dakota or into Canada, because to them, those were communities that didn't matter, or at least didn't matter as much as the urban rich communities. And this was only something I learned later from, from the Western Shoshone elders. We later brought, invited women to come to talk to us about that when we did some activism in the UK in the 90s to try to stop UK nuclear testing on the indigenous territory and land of the Western Shoshone. So what you have talked about really connects with me. But I began, after hearing the Pacific Women, I actually began to read a lot more, and of course immediately found some of your writings and started reading about your direct activism and your, how you connected up those issues, and reading about Wangari Maathai and, other, from Africa, also an ecofeminist thinker and activist, and the interconnections of activism and thinking. And ever since then, I have done my best to continue to listen, to hear, to learn, to engage. I frequently, when I speak, I will use quotes from you, Vandana, from Wangari Maathai, from amazing writers also like Audre Lorde, who have really helped me to understand, and therefore I want to share with my colonialist, racist, misogynist community and country here. And so in commenting now, I want to just pick up three elements that of what you said, but also apply it, because the fundamental for me is so these are all the things that we're wrong. As Kin Chi said, we are in an existential crisis. not just from climate, but from nuclear use and potential war. Meanwhile, of course, a lot of wars are destroying peoples and countries and lands all over the world, and have continued to do so ever since the 1939-45 war and the bringing, and the nuclear arms racing that we were told was going to stop war. But it didn't. It just relocated some of those wars, made, Western, Northern military industrial powers and all the money poured into those so-called defense military programs were actually used to fight wars in other countries. And we have to understand that nuclear weapons don't deter, but what they have given to some countries, and we had Tony Blair explicitly acknowledge this in his memoirs, and Vladimir Putin very recently act on it, which is a kind of freedom of action to engage in military adventurism. But of course, that's too nice a word, isn't it? What we're talking about is military invasion, killing, murder, the use of all kinds of increasingly sophisticated weaponry on people's homes. And we see this, we saw it in Iraq, Afghanistan, we see it in African countries which are using weapons that are made in Russia and the West, and so-called small arms, but they're deadly. And they're used also to destroy women's communities. They're used in the commission of crimes against women and girls, rape, and so on. So, so these kind of notions of deterrence are also, part of this colonialism that led into what was called the Enlightenment, but that you have so brilliantly unpicked to show us how unenlightened and how very deliberately destructive the military industrial colonialist imperialist expansionism that emanated out of Europe, emanated out of so many wars and invasions and conquests within Europe. And again, I had to get in touch with my own roots, coming, as a woman of Welsh ancestry, of how, going right back to the Romans, we were pushed into the mountains that were considered to be unhospitable for agriculture and were too difficult for the Romans to build their roads. So let's recognize that these things didn't just arrive. The British and weaponized and industrialized the already the warmongering and the misogynist elements of what had been done, and then we learned how to try and stop that being done to us by going out and doing it to others. So we need to actually really think about how we therefore don't keep reproducing the dangers of what has been done to us onto other people. So the three key issues, and maybe we can, I'm going to have to hurry. I think that white thing that Kinchi said means that I won't have much time. So I want to think about this future of humanity depends on the future of Mother Earth and Mother Nature. It was in the 80s that I began to be able to start talking about Mother Earth and Mother Nature and not feel foolish, not feel like I was some weird hippie. And so we, as part of this, it's also, I've just been so inspired by recent research on how trees communicate, the symbiotic collective communication among the trees and the forests connecting with the fungi, these biodiverse families of mushrooms. So I want us to think about the different means that different people need to use to make the difference in our own communities. We are fond of saying, think globally, act locally. The reverse is also true. Think locally, act globally, and everything in between that. I want to ask the question, what is coronavirus teaching us? There were some amazing things that happened in that first year of lockdown that almost helped to clean the skies, clean the rivers, clean the environment. So what are we, but it's as if we didn't learn anything. So now how do we learn from that? The second set of things that I wanted to briefly mention were, and maybe there isn't going to be time now, but I wanted to talk about why and how we constructed ICAN to be something that used the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, that changed the narrative, that stopped trying to argue using the very, the deterrence and the technical military terms, and turn it to what do weapons do? What do they do to people? What do they do to people's lives, their food, their agriculture, the climate? And this meeting just taken place in Vienna, where unfortunately I caught COVID, but nevertheless, it was very important. The first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that entered into force in January of 2021. Finally, the first meeting was being held. And amidst all the governments coming there and some international organizations, ICAN brought a new, younger generation of activists from the Pacific, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, over to Vienna to talk about their own direct experiences, their parents, their grandparents' experiences, and also to talk together about what they want to do to make the change, to actually help us implement the treaty. But in doing so, of course, it's about connecting in with preventing the destruction of the climate. So we were bringing climate activists who'd never thought about nuclear weapons, some of whom even thought that nuclear energy might be a solution, and gave them the space and created conditions where they would teach each other, learn from each other, and teach us as the older generation what the changes are that are needed. And then the final issue that I want to raise, and again, I really just won't have time, but is that violence against our Mother Earth is on a continuum with the direct violence against women and girls. It's deliberately embedded and institutionalized in many, but perhaps not all, religions and cultures. And we have got to address that in order to unleash the strength, the power, the creativity, and the change that is embedded in all the women and girls in the world. And also, by doing so, unleash different forms of understanding and creativity and gentleness and care for each other and care for Mother Earth in all the men and boys who are at the moment profiting in various kinds of ways from their a power, which is a power over, but need to learn with us about power of, power to do, power to change in order to protect each other and the earth. And I learned a great deal by being in Bengaluru in November 2015, where I was invited by Women in Black India to be on the jury of one of the World Courts of Women. It was an awful, awful experience in so many ways, because we sat there and we listened to so many women from so many places by video and in person, talking about the violence done to them in so many countries. And then we had to somehow come out with some kind of not just a verdict, but a what can we do now? But it was so fundamental, and it is so fundamental. And if we're not dealing with those issues, we're now seeing new forms of misogyny that are teaching young people that they're in the wrong body. Instead of recognizing that you know, that we as creatures, as part of nature, we depend on biological sex. That's how we reproduce. Within the biological sex, of course, we've got a whole diversity, natural diversities amongst ourselves, both of our sexualities and our way of being who we are as girls and boys and women and men. And I don't discount the very small number also of who are born with intersex, that is also part of natural diversity. But what we're seeing now is the big pharma that you spoke about, with the huge power and profiteering of social media, which is absolutely bound up with pornography being spread around the world, and the medicalization of our body, our, you know, the mind-body duality, trying to teach children that they are in the wrong body, that they need to take toxic chemicals to prevent puberty, which we all actually need to go through. It's part of our life cycle naturally. And also medical, your surgery, essentially surgery on healthy bodies. Having grown up with a sister who had polio before I was even born, and was quite disabled by that, and I'm going to stop in a moment, that I just want to say this. I believe profoundly that there are no wrong bodies, but for very many of us, our natural bodies are put into, are grown into, born into societies that do not respect the biodiversity, the natural diversities of all of our different bodies and experiences, and do not provide for us to grow to the best of our potential, as, you know, and with the healthcare that our own bodies need, which will come from many, many natural ways, but will also come from societal ways to provide us with greater access if we need wheelchairs or special help, if, you know, if we are not sighted, or we have difficulty hearing, or whatever. So to me, it's part of our understanding of biodiversity, and that the future of humanity depends on the future of Mother Earth and Mother Nature, that we also have to make common cause with people who are marginalized as disabled, or marginalized as being less abled, or being, you know, differently abled.
Thank you.
We have to create that as the future. And we have to do that with the young people from the grassroots onwards. But thank you so much, Vandana, for inspiring me to think about these things for so much of my life.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So now we are inviting Professor Tian Song to speak. He will speak in Chinese, so please turn to the English interpretation channel. You can see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen, and so please go for the interpretation into English. So Professor Tian Song is a professor in the Humanities Center, School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Southern University of Science and Technology. He got a PhD in Philosophy of Science in 2001 and a PhD in History of Science in 2002. He had been a professor in the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science at the Beijing Normal University for 15 years. He had worked as a teacher of physics, newspaper editor, TV planner, and columnist before 1998, when he started his doctoral studies. He did his postdoctoral research in Peking University and had been a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, Harvard University, and Cornell University. His research areas include philosophy of science, history of science, sociology of science, anthropology of science, environmental philosophy, science communication, and science and art. He prefers interdisciplinary case studies, and the cases vary from milk drinking and food industry to garbage. Professor TIAN is one of the earliest scholars who focus on garbage and waste issues in China. His recent studies concern civilization studies, such as the re-examination of industrial civilization and the construction of ecological civilization. In 2018, he proposed a research program on science, technology, society, and environment ecology. He has written many books, including The Jumping Board of History of Science, Beware of Science, Collapse by One Touch, Academic Demon, and Fourth Concubine Effect, a dialogue on science culture, and also The Remains of the World of Spirits, the Change of Nasi, which is the ancient ethnic group in China. So Professor TIAN gave a lecture last year at the South-South Forum on the topic, Garbage, the Dark Side of Industrial Civilization. Now the floor is yours, Professor TIAN.
Hi, everybody. Before I speak in Chinese, please allow me to say hello to Vandana SHIVA in English for some words. I wonder if you remember me, because when you visit China, maybe I forgot which year, but anyway, when I was a professor in Beijing Normal University, and I had a chance to invite you to give a lecture in the School of Philosophy, Beijing Normal University. I think that time you come to China for support the Chinese movement anti-GMO. Okay, now I speak Chinese, and it will make me more easier to express my idea. 非常感谢建之的邀请。
Thank you, Professor Lau, and I'm very honored to be able to be to join as a discussant for Professor Vandana. I think the theme of this forum is very interesting. Actually, the title is very pessimistic because we're talking about clash and the future. I remember that 20 years ago, when I was talking about that the civilization might have a demise or might have a clash, at that time, many of my friends think I'm joking or just like trying to catch the eyes, because at that time I did give such a, that was in the 2003. And now in 2020, because I think in 2028, there will be the end of the civilization. So that's why I think this topic is very interesting. So actually, I have some common experience as with Professor Vandana, because at that time because back in when I was a student, I studied physics and also studied the philosophy. And one of my PhD thesis is also about the quantum physics. So, but it's very interestingly, we all work on the road of anti-science. Professor Shiva's writings, I have read quite many, especially the one about the harvest that was stolen, because in the movement of the Chinese anti-GMO movement is very important. And recently, I also saw some new lectures and new writings from her, and it's also very inspiring. I think that our opinions are having too many in common. Although we don't have much direct communication, but her major thoughts I am in agree with. So as a discussant, this give me a very troublesome position, because I was supposed to give some arguments. That's why I would like to use some other form. I would like to, using my own words, my own theory and investigation or study, to try to give out her opinions in my own words. I think in her recent works, she used a concept of colonization. And he generalized, he expanded the idea, the concept of the nation of colonization, which is of the mind and of the thinking. So I think it's very natural. It's a very natural expand because of physics and of economics and politics. Of course, this kind of colonialism comes from the economics. Years ago, I did some research on milk, and that article I said that why human being has to drink the milk from cow.
市里的中国汉人喝牛奶，其实只有20-30年的历史，跟我们改革开放的历史差不多。我们从前是没有，尤其是汉民族根本是没有这种大规模的摄入奶的这种传统。那么我们为什么会把奶接受为一种日常食品？首先是在观念上我们接受了它。所以这个牛奶它首先
does not consume milk as a origin something that to be consumed daily. So milk is actually a product of ideology. One of my students made some studies on the history of the brief history of the intake of calcium. In our Chinese tradition, they do not do this sort of thing. It's not within our theory. It is only after they accepted the nutrition studies of the West that they began doing this. And after the Western theories of nutrition, nutrology took place of our traditional system, they began this. In other words, our knowledge system, our ideology, our theory have been colonized by Western nutrology. Professor Shiva has talked multiple times about ecofeminism. I talked about environmentalism at Beijing University for many years, and ecofeminism is an important part of this. And the response from our students are quite controversial. Some of them find the theory ridiculous. Well, I would often explain to them that it is a revolutionary theory. Its whole system, its whole ideal is revolutionary. Or to use Shiva's words, there is always the colonization of ideology, of ideas first. Our Chinese audiences, as for them, some of them are not very familiar with this ecofeminism. So there is this simple change. In the past, we talk about the relationship between human being and nature, or man and nature, or the contradiction between them. In this dichotomy, one is man, human beings, another is nature. Human beings as a whole is standing in opposition with nature, or having contradictions with it, or extract from nature, or destruct the nature. As for ecofeminism, this term or this category of human has been divided in that some part of the human beings, that is man, oppress both nature, and the other parts of human beings, that is women. So they make division between man and women, and put man against the nature. So in the past, there used to be the human being versus nature, and now there is man versus women and nature. So in terms of concept, this is one of the revolutionary changes. So after understanding this, we will accept the other part of this theory more easily. So conceptually, this is revolutionary. In the beginning, when I heard this term of ecofeminism, we will have feel such kind of perplexity. But we should try to train our mind to use this kind of concepts And soon we'll find that they are very strong at interpreting or explaining things. And then, as Shiva has repeatedly mentioned this concept of colonialism, colonization. In a few years ago, I wrote something about the major mechanisms of industrial system. One is this modernized globalization. A globalized modernization, it's a food chain. So there is an upper link and a lower link. And how does this food chain works? The upper link can take the initiative to use the energy and resources of the lower link and send the garbage to the lower link. This upper link around the globe, then Europe and the US are the upper link, and the third world countries are the lower link. As for the US, it's more developed regions are the upper link and less developed ones are the lower link. As for China, the eastern areas are the upper link, the western area are the lower link. As for a big city, the city center, the downtown area is the upper link, and the suburban areas and the countryside are the lower link. So around the downtown area, there is always big heaps of garbage. So the very bottom of this lower link is nature itself, the natural environment itself. So we can see that garbage always goes to the lower links, and the lower link is like the garbage islands in the Pacific Oceans or the outer space garbage. So this is a way of how human society goes. Jean Cope, the scientist, the scholar, says that this kind of civilization has no characteristic of justice, environmental-wise, or social or society-wise. This industrial system is based on natural sciences, that is math, physics, and GMO is part of its products. It's based on a mechanical view of the nature, that is to think of nature as a machine, but it is not a machine. So forcefully applying this theory is bound to cause, it will necessarily cause ecological environmental problems. Centuries of operation of industrial civilization has caused worldwide ecological and environmental crisis. I've talked about the upper link and lower link. The upper link grabs the energy and resources of the lower link. It tries to protect its own environment by taking away things from the lower link and putting garbage to the lower link, giving garbage to the lower link. As for the lower link, they need to exploit their natural environment, their natural system, to give it to the upper link. Well, it also strives to be the upper link. It receives garbage from the upper link and it produces its own garbage because of its own industrialization. So the lower link has more burden from the garbage. And this eco crisis is bound to break out first in the lower regions. And the globe is the earth as a whole. So any one single crisis is a crisis of the whole planet. So this outbreak of crisis in the lower links is actually a consequence of the destruction of the general ecosystem. Using another word that Gaia used by Shiva, Gaia is dying. Global warming and distinction of species are signs of this dying Gaia. As Gaia does, human civilization will collapse at the same time. So we're on a tipping point. If we can shift from industrial civilization to eco-civilization within relatively short time, our human civilization may continue. But if we don't do it fast enough, human civilization is bound to collapse, which is what we're talking about today on this ninth South-South Forum, the collapse of human civilization. So how to make this transition? I have 2 points to make. One, thorough complete criticism of industrial civilization. Second, learn and draw lessons from our traditions. And to put it more concretely, I found that I may have some empathy with Professor Shiva. Many years ago, I began to research into the issue of food. And I say that agriculture is the prerequisite and the foundation of eco-civilization. If our production of food is not ecological, we won't be able to build a eco-civilization. Our understanding of food in the past, as Shiva puts it, that in the past we have a living earth, then we took the earth as a dead material, and we make food also some kind of material. So what is food? I have a new concept, that is, food is the medium between human beings and other species. Take note that except salt, all of our food come from other forms of life, other species. So when we have anything to do with food, we're having something to do with other species. So only in a living earth, in living soil, the plant that grows in this can be called food. But industrialized agriculture makes the living earth, the living soil, something dead. And the food produced from this industrialized food is not food. So now I come back to the conclusion that I put forward beginning. Construction of eco-civilization must begin with eco-agriculture, from food, from our nutrition, from our diets. Then a stronger way of saying that the middle class has an obligation and responsibility to choose organic food. Although it's more expensive, it's a step towards eco-civilization. We should change our idea or perception of food, of nature. All we come back to Shiva's discourse. We try to decolonize our colonized mind and go back, return to our tradition, to look for, to explore a kind of unmachinery view of the nature, ecological view of nature, the Gaia view of nature, this non-mechanical view of the nature can enable us to see the earth as a living earth. Only through this we can construct eco-civilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tian. So, so now we would go to the the discussion time. But then before that, I would like to invite Ella and Ona to speak, because when Dr. Vandana SHIVA spoke at the South-South Forum in 2020 and 2021, I requested these 2 young ladies to ask questions and prepare some handmade gifts. So I made the same request this year, and the gifts can only be delivered electronically. So now, Ella, Ona, please speak.
So hello, Dr. Vandana SHIVA and everybody.
Hello.
This is Ella and this is Ona, and we were so happy to see you again, and your talk was very interesting. So now we would like to show you a video we made about our planting experience.
Ooh, a tomato. Ooh, a worm. Oh no. Help! At least I still have the tomato. Had the tomato. What a long day. Phew. There is a complex ecosystem of insects and animals in nature. Some are beneficial to plants. Chemical pesticides don't make a distinction between pest and helpful animals. They may pollute the soil, water, and air. Instead, use organic, homemade, plant-based pesticides such as chili, garlic, or salt mixtures. Wrapping fruits in mesh is also a good way to prevent pests from eating them without harming other animals. The end. Bye.
This small planting project started when my teacher gave us some tomato plant seeds, and I had two seeds which grew into little plants after 1 or 2 months. There were actually two, but one got bitten by an insect on the root of the stem, so it died. So there were some challenges, and I learned from this experience that a lot of time and effort is needed to grow a plant naturally. And it was also lucky that we live near Lingnan University, which has a vegetable garden. I could put the tomato plant in when it was too big to grow indoors. So I also think that people living in urban areas may find this process of growing plants naturally to be too time-consuming and requiring too much effort, especially if they have busy schedules. So Dr. Vandana SHIVA, what would you suggest like these urban people can do to be self-sufficient and grow plants to feed themselves?
So, even the busiest people find time to go see a movie, go to a gym, go to a yoga class. And what we do in NAVDANYA is we say, taking care of the soil and the seed and growing a plant is doing the yoga of the earth. So make that part of your life, because as Dr. Song said so clearly, food is the currency of life. Food is the basis of life. The mechanized thought made it look like stuff, just stuff. And, our textbooks even teach, because I work with children, and the textbooks say food is the fuel for running the body as a machine. But our bodies are not machines, and food is not fuel. Food is living. Good food is living, bad food can cause death. So I think, Dr. Song talked about how we need to shift from an industrial mindset and industrial civilization to an ecological civilization. And for that, part of your day must go in, even if it's one plant you take care of. Let that be the discipline of building your ecological civilization and your relationship with the earth, the relationship with your food.
So, Vandana, could you go on responding to what Rebecca and Tian-Song have said?
For sure. First, thank you for both of you. It's a joy meeting you. I remember Greenham Common with a lot of fondness, and there used to be a song, will there be womanly times or will we die? There will be womanly times, we will not die. And that was the resistance and the creative resistance that your own life has gone through. I have increasingly, right from my work on the agriculture and the Green Revolution, or even before, the whole issue of destruction of forests and monocultures, I see an extractive colonizing economy as a war against the earth. And that's why one of my books is called Making Peace with the Earth. As a war against the earth, it focuses, it makes our mind focus only how efficient the extraction is. Not how much externality it creates, not how much garbage, pollution it creates, not how many people are dispossessed in the process. And I personally feel sad that, you know, in this land where we had a beautiful prayer, which our Prime Minister read at the first environmental summit in Stockholm in 1972, which is, you know, Mother Earth, give me life. And may I never harm you, may I never pierce your vitals so that you can keep sustaining me. And, you know, now the sort of national symbol in India has become this thing called the JCB, you know, this earth moving machine, which just doesn't care. It just pulls down buildings, it pulls down anything that's unwanted. But a mind without limits doesn't have space for anything. You know, when you talked about place for all, the diversity of all, that's the growing intolerance for life. And most people don't know that, you know, even companies like Google, who you think you'd only do a Google search through, they've entered manipulation of life. They have a life sciences division to manipulate life. And, you know, this fourth industrial revolution of basically changing who we are, just like they tried to genetically modify our food, now they want to genetically modify humans. But the head of this division actually says we've got to defeat Mother Earth forever. So from the time of industrial civilization to now, this has been the intention. And for me, the ultimate making peace with the earth is recognizing that we depend on Mother Earth. We have life because she gives us life. And that a civilization that sustains the earth is a higher civilization. And a civilization that predates on the very foundations of existence is very primitive, crude, heartless, careless civilization. Or as Gandhi said when he was asked, what do you think of industrial civilization? He turned around and said, it would be a good idea. Because to be civilized is to have structures of values, structures of systems of governance. And industrialism is so predatory that it is not worthy of being called civilized. On the issues of Dr. Song, I think, yes, you're so right that we have to reclaim the foundations of the epistemology of our ecological civilization that has been attacked repeatedly by colonialism of all ages. We have to make them relevant to our times. I'm, you know, very humble to say, actually, the Chinese who work with John Cobb gave me the John Cobb Award this year for ecological civilization and the common good. And here we are, you know, at this level of how do you work at peace with the earth. We are all coming together. But the big money machine needs to keep people fighting each other. Because, you know, that's what Rebecca's work is, fighting the military industrial system. The military industrial system is so desperate for a fight in the wars, you know, continuing wars. And I personally feel, you know, this strange entity called the Quad was created. Yeah, US, Japan, Australia, and why India in the middle? Why India in the middle? And with a purely one objective of somehow declaring war against China. And I think this war against the earth, which is the ecological catastrophe, was to keep the lubrication of money-making going and constantly divide and rule, that we have to, through new mechanisms of ecological civilization, create bonds of love and friendship, you know? And that's where I thank Kin Chi so much for organizing these fora on South-South solidarity and the future of humanity. I don't even know if I'm in between. I know visas were blocked for the Chinese. And I think that is something that is not desirable. I think we need new friendships. We need deeper solidarities. And we definitely need, as you know, as Rebecca said, not just global thinking and local action, but global action to be unified for regenerating the earth.
Thank you. We have some questions from the audience in China. So that will be read out in Chinese. So please go to your English channels.
The first question, you mentioned that the fertilizers created by the modern chemical industry destroy the soil and create large amounts of carbon dioxide. But fertilizers increase crop yields and feed large populations. How do we balance the need to feed such a large population with the aim to achieve ecological agriculture? Is there an, how can we balance that? Is there an ecological farming technique that is comparable to the output of modern use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides? Question number 2.
Oh, okay.
Could you
Yeah.
please?
Yes.
Could you please
Yeah.
elaborate on what climate colonization entails? Will the climate issue be the last arena in which capitalism capitalizes? Does this signal the imminent collapse of capitalism? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. The mythology is that chemical fertilizers increase yield. And then yield is treated as food. And the reason this is not a scientifically correct interpretation is because yield only measures the output of a monoculture commodity. So if in my farm I can grow 12 products, 12 crops, not only do they have synergy with each other, Dr. Sung pointed out, an ecological civilization is how the insects and the pollinators contribute. We have 6 times more pollinators on our farm than in the forest. And 1/3 of the food, we've done calculations, scientific measurements, that 1/3 of the food comes from the pollinators. Huge amounts of food comes from the earthworms. Large amount of foods comes from the mycorrhizal fungi, and we have 360 times more fungi on the NAVDANYA farm than in the chemical farms in our valley. So 3 things. Number 1, we must measure the total output, the total biodiversity output that an ecosystem can produce rather than the yield of a monoculture, because the yield of a monoculture is a monoculture. And for an ecological production, we need diversity, both because diversity creates synergy. When you have a cereal with beans, the nitrogen is provided by the beans themselves. And the West only woke up to nitrogen fixing plants recently, whereas we've been growing nitrogen fixing plants for nitrogen fixing forever. For me, one of the big incomplete projects is, soybean came from East Asia. Soya is the food of the Chinese and the Japanese. It was always fermented. How has it become the most colonizing crop? I have a chapter in my Stolen Harvest book on soya imperialism, because we suffered this with a ban on our indigenous edible oils. So we must look at the full output, not the yield of a single crop. Number 2, we must look at the total cost benefit. That is true productivity. How much do you spend and how much do you earn? In chemical agriculture, industrial agriculture, the farmer's income is always negative. They spend more than they earn. So it doesn't work for the farmers. That's why farmers are getting marginalized, farmers are disappearing. Third, as we've reiterated throughout this evening, food is the connector with life. Food is what connects us to the soil and other life forms. Food is what makes our health. Therefore, what matters in food is how diverse and healthy and nutritious it is. The weight of food is not a relevant indicator for eating. It might be a relevant indicator for putting a commodity on a cargo ship. It is not an indicator for healthy food. The research and indicators have all shown that about 70% of the nutrition has been lost in the industrial food system. I'm trying to look for a graph, it should be in one of our reports, of how The more you use chemical fertilizers, the more you destroy the soil. You know, Rebecca talked about the forest floor, but actually organic soils have the same mycorrhizal fungi density, which is then bringing nutrition, taking carbohydrates, and is the big web of life in the soil. If you do, you know, when I started training farmers, I used to take an earthworm and sprinkle urea on it to see what happens. It dies. Earthworms are vital for fertility. Earthworms are vital for soil aeration. Earthworms are vital for draining water. When earthworms are dead, you have compacted soils. The chemical fertilizers kill the life of the soil. That's why you have desertification, you have compaction. But your basic question on the yield, this is the graph for India. This is the yield response. You have to keep using more fertilizer and the yield keeps coming down. The data is so clear, the yield doesn't go up. The first time there'll be a pump, but it's not a true output measurement because it's only one crop. You've taken 12 crops and reproduced them with one. And then you measure that one. Of course, when you have only one, you know, if the world is full of Chinese, there'll be more Chinese. But Chinese are in China and Indians are here. So the minute you create a monoculture, you have a tautology, there will be more of the monoculture. That's why the measurement of yield is an irrelevant measure. And we talk of nutrition per acre and health per acre. And we have this report, which is available on the NAVDANYA website. And this winter we will be doing, in October 1st to 12th, we are doing our course on Return to Earth, which is the same as building ecological civilization. This health per acre, organic solutions to the hunger and malnutrition, is our studies on measuring biodiversity, then converting it into nutrition. And we can feed 2 times India's population by intensifying biodiversity rather than chemicals. Biodiversity intensification protects life on Earth. It produces more nutrition, not yield of one commodity, but most importantly, it increases the nutrition in each crop. There's a meta study in the British Nutrition Journal that about 70 to 80% nutrition goes up. Just like chemical fertilizers drops the crops of nutrition, ecological agriculture increases the nutrition in every crop, and together the diversity increases the availability. Your question on, you know, climate, I would just call it climate imperialism. Now, climate imperialism and climate injustice is at many levels. The first is, it is colonialism that is the original root of the climate crisis. After all, what did colonialism do? Chop down the forests, create monocultures, you know, indigo and opium in Bihar, and destroy the biodiversity, the area where finally Gandhi did the civil disobedience and non-cooperation against indigo plantations and slavery. The place is called Champaran. Champaran means the forest of the Champa. You know, it was a forest. And then it was growing indigo for exploitation. So the first level at which climate change begins is deforestation and destruction of agriculture in order to have plantations and monocultures, because that, as I said, is where you stop the absorption of the carbon dioxide and you just increase, and you break the cycle. The second is the fossil empire. The fossil empire beginning with coal in England 200 years ago, but continuing with oil in America. And when, you know, we talked about Rockefeller, we talked about IG Farben, but between them is Standard Oil. Standard Oil was the global monopoly of the Rockefellers over oil of the world. They pushed oil all over. They pushed oil into our food. They pushed oil into our transport. They just pushed oil wherever they could. And this was broken down as an antitrust decision to the many oil companies we have, but they began as Standard Oil. Now, if you add up all of this, this is the basis of the climate problem. Now, the rich countries, the industrialized countries created the climate problem, and the original climate treaty was to regulate the emissions. That's what Obama broke by preventing the legally binding emissions. And Paris then became a voluntary system. Glasgow, based on this book that I showed to you, is really a shift. In 1992 at the Earth Summit, the principles that were laid out in law were the polluter pays. The polluter should pay. And the second was precautionary principle. If you don't know for sure that this is safe, then don't go ahead. That's what was used in many countries on the GMO question. Now, the polluter should pay for all the damages. Look at the floods in China. Look at the floods in India. I mean, roughly every year I do a rough calculation. We have about 10 to 20 to $40 billion of damage every year because of climate disasters. And this is just pure direct damage, not the irreversible destruction of ecosystems. The entire fund, climate fund was supposed to be 100 billion, which they haven't been putting. They put a miserable thing. But while everyone was looking at the justice on losses and damages, and the polluter should pay, the polluters have come up with these new mechanisms. And these are the new mechanisms where those who created the climate problem are going to use the climate problem with the economic power they have to discipline those who never caused the problem, who are suffering the impact, to say, now you cannot do this and now you cannot do this. And suck up. They will use the climate conditionalities, the false green, this greenwashing, to suck the rest of the remaining world into their one big giant money machine, now working on financialization of nature. You know, capitalism was still about capital. Now financialization is about giving a financial fictitious value to real things. So therefore, the ecological civilization issue is about real values, which means to be strong, to be resilient. It is about justice. The polluters must pay. It is about remembering. And most importantly, it is about, you know, the young Ina for their lovely tomato plant, you know. I mean, that should be a lesson to all. 2 young girls sitting in Hong Kong can grow a tomato plant. Shouldn't we all be growing our food? The 2 areas where our refusal to cooperate with this end of civilization project is defend the land you have. Don't let it go. Take care of it, not as property, but as Mother Earth in your custody. And secondly, grow your food in whatever way. Not individual. If you can't individually, create the food communities. Create direct relationships with farmers. Because we have to create another economy of love, solidarity, mutuality, cooperation, rather than the destructive economy of extraction, competition, monopolies, and the death of nature.
Thank you so much, Vandana. So I would like to give 1 minute each to Professor Song and also to Rebecca. So 1 minute, yes. Professor Song, Tian Song, please.
Okay, thanks. I speak Chinese again. I
would like to respond to one of the questions. It's often been posed that is, without pesticides and chemicals, many people will be starved to death. This is not a real question. It's a fake question. So first, according to Shiva, the apparent increase in yield is what they've stolen from the future. So this is also the other concept of Shiva. This is colonization of the future. She also showed us this curve. We can see how much we've stolen from the future. Because of chemicals, they are having less and less marginal effects. And the second, industrialized agriculture. The use of chemicals makes soil, agriculture land a source of pollution. Something grow on a source of pollution cannot be called food. Then how do we calculate its yield since it's not food? And then thirdly, I would like all of you to pay attention to Professor Jiang Gaoming's work. He has a eco farm that has been working for over a decade. And it shows that pure eco agriculture yield can be no lower than that of the industrialized agriculture. And also, according to Shiva, it has higher quality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Rebecca, 1 minute, please.
I really just want to say thank you to Vandana, to Kin Chi, to Jade, as always, to Lingnan, where I was given so much hospitality and enabled to speak to so many students, and to say that there were some comments in the chat that were saying, you know, about colonialism and imperialism, and about the enslavement of Black men and boys. And I totally understand where those are coming from. And yes, it is absolutely essential, coming from where I come, as the, you know, an incredibly damaging, harmful countries, a group of small islands that caused so much harm and destruction and pain to so many countries around the world. But I also have to recognize that I am who I am. This is my background, and all that I can do with, indeed, the privileges and the benefits that accrued to my being born where I was born and grown up, is to try to undo and to unpick. And so intersectionalism is incredibly important in recognizing that we can only work where we are. And who we are is part of what we can either spend all our time trying to apologize for, or be more useful in actually recognizing where we can maybe make a difference. And that's why it's so important to me to recognize white privilege and colonial harm, but also to try to move beyond that collectively with the peoples, you know, of the whole world. And in this regard, also to recognize the ongoing and particular harms being done to women and girls around the world by military, industrial, misogynist, colonialist, racist forms of economy and politics and social systems, and, you know, the personal is political. I just welcome all the opportunities that we can have to talk about these issues together, learn from each other, and keep on making the changes in the lands that we are in, and the places where we are, and the skin that we are in order to celebrate and protect our Mother Earth, because our Mother Earth, our Mother Nature, is mother to all of us. We share her. We need to collectively protect her.